I'm gonna present some case studies, and just so you know, this presentation did not look like this when I left home. It completely disappeared from my computer, so me and Pam shared a problem. So I had to reconstruct this last night. So if I seem a bit confused about my slides, that might be why. I'm not sure, coincidence, but yeah. And I also just want to tie back to what Pam talked about and what I've talked to some of you about as well, is that I really would love for us to sort of like kickstart our group again, and our discussion group especially. So one suggestion I've had for a while is to actually do, you all are familiar with Zoom, like Skype-ish, like a monthly Zoom meeting is one thing I have, because I feel like it's a lot more, when there's a set time and date and you see people eye to eye, face to face, it's a lot easier to have this like familiar, you don't misunderstand each other as much because you have a face to look at and things like that. So that's one thing I would really love for us to start doing. So I'm probably gonna bug you all about that later. But yeah, let's get going with some case studies. And I did realize, especially last night when I redid this, that this might not be the best case studies to present for other consultants, because these are actually not clients' birds. These are birds that I have worked with personally. So I basically just chose some cases that were my favorites. But yeah, we'll take a look at them anyways. So the first case is Vilda. Vilda is a blue and gold macaw, and she's a female. And at the time when I started doing this consulting with her, she was about a year old. I did consult with her owner previous to that as well, when she was about 6 months old, for similar problems, but not the specific same problems. And she is a free-flying bird, but she's also a pet bird. She lives in an aviary-style setting with other macaws. The minimum cage requirements for macaws in Sweden is about 6.3 square meters, which is about the size of a small bedroom. So there's really no macaw cages, at least not for the people keeping them legally. And she is a bird that gets very, very easily excited. She goes from 0 to 100 like that. And she had a problem with biting. Not biting to inflict damage, but nipping very hard when she got very excited, basically. And she especially did it to all other people than her primary caretaker. So this is her. And Vilda in Swedish means the wild one, basically. So she had been like that since she was very young. She was a bird that was hand-raised alone, so no siblings or anything like that, which I think is a big contributor to why she became the way she was. So like I said, she's always been like that. And I did meet with her when she was about 6 months old. She was like that then too. So her owner wanted some tips on how she could stop her from biting when she did recall training, because the bird would be super excited, flying to her hand, landing, and then just going, ah, not because she wanted to hurt her, but because she was so excited and just redirected to nipping. And they could be cuddling or doing whatever, and she would start like biting fingers real hard. Again, not to draw blood or anything, just because she wanted to bite on something because she was so up there. And she would bite pretty much everyone except the preferred person, and sometimes her preferred person as well. And she reacted very strongly to things moving around her. So if someone moved their hand in close proximity to her, she would react very quickly and bite them. And she was trained for free flight, which she did very well. She had a good recall, but her owner was not very into like the formal aspects of training, so that free flight training wasn't very formal, and she didn't do anything else. Basically, they had they called it playful relationship. So it could look like this. I'm getting some shaky video, but really no formal way of interacting. They just basically both did their thing and it worked out, but apparently they had some issues as well. So the problem was that I moved in because this is Korpdalen, by the way, where I worked as a trainer for a while. And the owner, wanted to expand on what she was doing, get a lot of other birds as well, and do educational, like have an educational facility with birds. That was her goal, which she's doing a wonderful job with now. But she wasn't very into the training sides of things, which is where I got in. So the goal was for me to use this bird for flight demonstrations, which was very tricky because no one could handle her except for the owner. So we obviously had a lot of work to do there. So a functional assessment of the problem here could be something like this. So whenever she landed on a hand or something, like a hand moved in close proximity to her, she would tighten her feathers, do the typical I'm about to lunge body language, and bite whatever is closest to her. So most often that would be a hand. If she's sitting on it, or if someone tried to approach her or pet her or anything like that. And the possible consequences here is sensory feedback. It is hands moving away from her, and also the reactions from people. You can tell that as soon as someone got a bit excited, and especially since her owner is a very easily excitable person as well, she reacted very strongly to that with all the blushing and getting the small pupils and everything like that. And I think just to talk a bit about biting in general, you all probably know how it's a common recommendation, especially on the internet, that if a parrot bites, you should just stay still, ignore it. I agree, Pam, which is ridiculous. And one of the sort of metaphors I use with clients to explain why that can be a really bad idea, especially with a frustrated bird, is that, I mean, people punch walls, for God's sake. Walls don't react, it still feels very good. We get that sensory feedback, we get an outlet. So just a bird, the sensory feedback of biting is quite enough. It doesn't have to be things moving away, it doesn't have to be reactions from people. So if they're biting you, it's probably already being reinforced, even if you're ignoring it. Walls don't have to react for it to feel good to punch them when you're mad. So, so that's a typical picture of her in her very easily excitable state. So macaws blush, you all probably know that. The small pupils, very tight feathers, and like upright body language. So my plan with her was to work very hard to build a reinforcement history of calm behaviors around hands, because that's what we want to see. And trying to punish a bird that is very excited and bites, it's not going to work. It's a very bad idea, it's not very ethical and not very effective. So we also needed to desensitize her to hands moving around her and towards her and things like that, and not get bitten while working on this was the main goal. So I started working with her in protected contact, and protected contact is something that's used in the zoo world a lot. We should be using it a lot more with parrots too, I think. It basically means that we're not in the same space as the parrot. We work with a physical barrier between us, so that could be the bird in a cage and me outside of a cage, the bird in an aviary, me outside, or just anything with a barrier that we can work through. So the first step here was for me to even being able to give her treats, because what do I need to do to give her a treat? I need to move my hand towards her, and she would react even there and start biting at things. So what we did was I set up a perch close to the mesh, to the aviary, that was like, what do you call it, parallel to the mesh, so she could move like back and forth. So she would sit there and I could present a treat here, move my hand towards her, but it's still very far away from her. She could walk towards it, take the treat. And then I could present one at the other side, she could walk towards it and take a treat. And then we could gradually decrease that distance until she learned that, well, if she moves her hand towards me, it just means that a treat is coming, so okay, that's fine. And the other good thing about the mesh is that it would, if she got excited and tried to bite at the fingers, I would have a very easy way to not get bitten, because that happened too. So that's where we started. And then we transitioned to a free contact setting. So what I did then was very short, very high quality sessions. And at the very beginning, that could be just me slowly walking into the aviary, giving her one treat, and then walking back out. I did not want to spend time in there if I didn't have my full attention on her, making sure that she was very calm, very relaxed all the time. And then I would gradually increase the time I was there. So I walked in, gave her a treat, stood there, gave her another treat, very fast, but not with fast movements, just very rapid, like a high rate of reinforcement for that calm behavior, and then gradually decreased the amount of time I was there. Then we wanted to start working on very calm, hands-off behaviors, where I don't have to touch her, she doesn't have to touch me, but she can still do something in order to earn that reinforcer. So we target trained a bit, for example, and very easy things like that. Let's see. And then we sort of transferred to stepping up, which was very interesting too. And I utilized the same setup there. So I had that perch. I could present my hand at the end of the perch. She would walk towards it, and we would very slowly build that behavior, just putting a foot on my hand, keeping beak up, because you can't have your beak up and bite a hand at the same time, which is very convenient. And once she got really solid doing that, we could transfer to recalls. So this was the first time she was on my hand, looking very relaxed, which is exactly what I wanted. And this is the first time she's even sitting on another person than her owner. So, and she's freely flighted, like I said, so we're outdoors, she can fly away anytime. So there. I just want to show this video because it's very funny, if you can see. It's a testament to her excitable nature, I think. Even her waves she does like with all of her body and just like, yeah, this is so much fun. And then when we started working with her outside, doing longer distance recalls and things like that especially, I started with doing that not to my hand, but to something else that she could land on, because one of the problems we did have was that she was so excited by flying that when she landed, she would just immediately redirect and start chewing on fingers and things like that. So this could look like that. And you see, I didn't even wait for her to take the treat there, I just put it on the stump. But then gradually we worked the same way, and we had a really good working relationship at the end of it all, when I could recall her to my hand and not have to worry about getting bitten very much. I forgot to connect the sound, I think, but it doesn't matter that much. What you would hear me say in that video is something like perfect when she lands, because I was so happy with with the progression there. And so this is the bird who would not be touched by anyone, was very excitable by hands, and bit everyone about a month later. Also note that I'm very aware that this is a bird with a biting history, so my hand is in a position where I could very easily remove it if I would have to. But she's very much enjoying that. And that was the first time I actually got to touch her, which was very fun. I'm glad I had my camera there. It was a nice moment. So yeah. And that's just because it's a nice looking picture. I love her. And to date, this is one of my favorite birds to work with. I love her so much, and I think her especially is a very good, it's a good way to show the danger of labels. Many people would have just accepted this as being a bitey, annoying bird, and then, yeah, too bad. But by doing a functional assessment, working with her very gradually, realizing that where we're at now doesn't mean we can't go somewhere else, we could get very far. And she's definitely one of the best free-flying showbirds I've ever worked with. So, and she works very well with other people now as well. Not everyone, she's very particular, but if someone has started to work with her, they have a lot easier time doing so now, because generalizing to other people is much easier. So yeah, Then we're moving on to the lorikeets, my favorites. So these were birds I worked with at the zoo where I used to work. They're called Rio and Flit, and their problem was that they were very passionate when it comes to hair, which doesn't sound like a big problem, but it was in this case. So they were a pair of lorikeets. They lived in a walk-in aviary with 10 other rainbow lorikeets. We did not know their exact age, but they were about 6 to 10 years old. They were reproducing. They had babies the 2 years before. We knew that much. And they really, really loved flying to people's heads and just licking and biting hair. And they did it both to keepers, which was manageable, but they also started doing it to visitors, which was not as manageable, because during opening hours, there will always be someone there watching and things like that. But if a bird lands on your head and you're not really prepared and you're scared of birds, this will happen a lot. So it was a danger to both people because they could get bit, and it was a danger to the birds as well. And the problems began pretty shortly after they moved in. So during the time of training when I was there, this was about 2 years ago, they had progressively gotten worse during that time. And the behavior was that they would fly towards heads or shoulders, anywhere where they could reach hair, hold on with their feet and their beak, just like, yeah, I'm not gonna leave this alone, lick and chew hair. And it was mostly aimed at keepers, like I said, but also sometimes guests. And they would not step off voluntarily. These were not tame birds. They were not hand-tamed either, not trained to step up or anything like that. And the zoo did not want to do this on purpose because they didn't want them sitting on people's hands. But what some of the keepers were doing when they landed on their heads was trying to remove them with their hands, which led to biting developing, which is not that very weird if you know behavior. They also tried using sticks to get them off. So the lorikeets were becoming quite wary of some of the keepers, not really like trusting them, and being a lot more loud when they were close by. Also, it became a disruptor because what we want in a zoo is for animals to do the behaviors they're supposed to do. And if they are very upset with a keeper close by, that disrupts their behavioral repertoire. So that's not a very, very good place to be. So this is what it could look like. Very intense licking behavior towards that. And this is Rio. That's what you had to sit through whenever you were on lorikeet duty. Basically just, and guests thought it looked hilarious, of course, but I just had to sit there and be like, yeah, it's not, but okay. So an important thing to know here is that lorikeets are nectarivorous birds, so they eat nectar, and they have this very specialized tongue. Anyone who's worked with lorikeets know this. It basically looks like, I think it looks like a miniature like dish brush, can you say that? So it has these tiny hairs on them, and which makes sense because if your food is sort of a liquid, it makes more sense to have more, well, something with a lot of, losing words again. The surface area, thank you, yeah, picks up water better than a flat surface. So it makes a lot of sense. And they're also, it's very ingrained in their behavioral repertoire to lick things. That's what they're supposed to do. It's their natural foraging behavior. So the functional assessment here was something like this. They would spot a keeper with hair. We also had keepers without hair, which were safe. Unless they wore hats, because then they were sort of, oh, well, hats, I can lick hats too, that's fine, it's a head. So they would fly towards heads or shoulders, land, grip hair with feet, and then stay there and chew and lick it like you saw in the video. And the possible consequences here is, of course, the sensory feedback would make a lot of sense. Other consequences were attention from the keepers. Some of them liked the keepers very much. And also hands and sticks moving towards the bird. Probably not a reinforcer, but it was still a consequence, so we wanted to include it. So my hypothesis was that it's the sensory feedback from licking, mostly, that acts as a positive reinforcer. and the waving birds away was probably aversive, but it was apparently not punishing because they still kept licking hair and being on heads, so we know that for sure. So keepers still kept doing this, chasing the birds off, even though it didn't have any noticeable effect long term. But since the birds flew off, it was probably very reinforcing to the keepers, so they kept doing it anyway, like we see with dogs pulling on leads. You yank them and they don't pull for 2 seconds, and then repeat and repeat and repeat. So we had some special consideration here. For example, there were several keepers with very different experience levels and very different views on training. Some didn't know about training at all. Some thought it was a cool idea, but they hadn't had any experience with it. And some just didn't care. But I was lucky enough to have a very allowing boss. She let me basically do whatever I wanted. So if I wanted to train an animal or do something, she was like, yeah, sure, you can go for it. If you can find time, go for it. And we also know that licking is a natural, very highly reinforcing behavior for lorikeets. So we definitely need to take that into consideration when we think about how we want to deal with this behavior, because it's obviously something that's very important to them. So we can't just take that away. It's also very difficult focusing on training birds when the enclosure is open to visitors, because I have to keep track of a lot of visitors and 11 other birds while I focus on training one bird. So that was a problem. And the plan also needed to be very easy to utilize for keepers without training background. So I couldn't have a very complex plan that required a lot of knowledge or skill, because then they would not do it. And another problem was that the birds could not be shifted during cleaning or maintenance. They had one inside aviary and one outside, so they could choose wherever they wanted to be at any given time, but I couldn't shift them. So that was also a problem, because then I couldn't shift them out, go in and clean, and then only have very specialized moments where I trained, so I had to think about training all the time when we were in there, which made it difficult at first. So what I wanted to do was teach an incompatible behavior, basically. When the keeper is in the enclosure, if they put both feet on a branch, they can't do that and sit on my head at the same time, then they get to lick hair, basically. So if you stay on your branch, I'll make sure you get to this good stuff. You just can't sit on my head. So they would still get the reinforcer licking and chewing hair. They would still get the attention, which they liked, and we could also add the extra reinforcer of rewarding them with food for staying on the branches, so we could add some variability there. And this actually worked very well. Visitors thought it was very funny when I walked up to a bird and went like this, but it made them ask questions, which is good. We could start a conversation off that about the natural behavior of lorikeets and why they lick things and things like that, so that was really good. This was, of course, difficult in the beginning because, like I said, I couldn't shift them. So we had to have very high ratio of reinforcement with these two birds at first, and then transition to a variable ratio schedule. And I also had to use some extinction, because if I wouldn't have, I probably wouldn't have been as successful with reinforcing them on the perches. So whenever they would fly at me, I would just duck. You became very good at keeping track of where they were, and as soon as you saw someone sort of getting ready, then you just ducked and they flew past, sat on the branch, waited a few seconds, and then here. But preferably what I would have liked to was, of course, make sure that they didn't even try that old behavior, just reinforce them very heavily for staying. But since I also had to clean and do stuff, sometimes that was very difficult. We also made some other changes. So one of the things we did was use a lot of antecedent arrangements. So I reintroduced a lot of different enrichment items with similar reinforcers offered, but only had them there when keepers were present. They did have a lot of licking opportunities even in other times as well, so they were fed with these little automats that they had to lick. We took like dish brushes and soaked them with nectar and hung them, so they had to lick nectar from things, all kinds of things like that. Also fresh flowers when we had them. So we made things like ice cream bird ice cream, just frozen mushed up bananas and nectar that they could lick when we were in there. And we also, there was one area in the enclosure where there was like a tree with a branch that was exactly the height of a head. So what we did was teach them to sit there, especially, which meant that I could stand in front of the branch, they could lick my head, and I could still look at all the visitors and the other birds. So I didn't have to actively train them. They could just do their thing and then go away without me having to pay attention to them. We also worked a lot, or I worked a lot on stationing, training them so that I could shift them from the inside to the outside and not have to worry about this a lot, which also helped with a lot of other things. When you have 12 birds living in a very huge planted aviary, it can be hard spotting all of them at once, which we have to do at least twice a day. We have to make sure that everyone's okay, looking good, no one's injured or anything like that. So that really helped with getting us closer to the birds and seeing every one of them every day. And I also wanted to teach a step-up behavior with these two birds especially, because if they were to land on a visitor, which even if we train them, it probably will happen, I wanted us to be able to go up to that bird, have it step up on a perch, not because it's scared of the perch and want to escape, but because stepping up on perches is good. So, and then we could reinforce that. So these were some of the things we did when we were in the enclosures, making sure they had a lot of other cool stuff to focus on, except for us. This is just some sisal string that I had on my keys, especially for these birds. So I had a portable parrot toy that they only get to play with when I'm there. And then some banana nectar ice cream there. And this was the perch that I talked about that I could just stand in front of and they could do what they wanted and I could keep track of everything else going on. So that's all of them stationing. A lot of lorikeets in a row. Super cute. And that is a picture of the step-up training that we did. So stationing training 12 lorikeets at once was an adventure, but it was it taught me a lot as a trainer. So I'll show you how the behavior looks like. The video wants to start. And this is actually very fun because the nectar mix that they get from that syringe, it was freely available to these birds all day, but they loved eating from that syringe. So just delivering the food in another way was enough to make that into a very high value reinforcer for them, as you can see. So that was super useful. And then we could, once I had every bird stationing, it was much easier to train the step-up behavior, because if you start training one bird with a food reinforcer, everyone else in that aviary is going to want them to. So having them on the station, teaching that duration was very important. And the cool thing about this is that once we had that licking on stimulus control, we gained a new reinforcer that I could use for training other behaviors. So I often used my bags or my head to reinforce them for stepping up or for targeting or for flying somewhere that I wanted them to go. So it could look like this. Whoops, sorry. For later. Super excited. And they're so cute. It was very funny. I quit working at that zoo about 3 years ago now, I think. I went there last year, hadn't been there in so long, and these two especially recognized me immediately. I tried just to see what, because I know they haven't continued with the training, sadly, especially not the stationing training and things like that, but I wanted to see if they remembered. So I did our whistle. Every bird was inside, and all of them just darted outside to the spot where we're usually at. And the visitors were like, oh my God, how did you do that? So yeah, it was very fun getting to see them again. Lorikeets are the best, aren't they? Love them. So yeah, any questions about that one?
No, maybe the stationing, did you get aggression between them? Because it's meant a lot of
You're like Eleanor. So that's an excellent point, and that's a very. I would have preferred to have like 10 more hands for sure. It would have made it a lot easier. First, when I started training that behavior, they were fewer. So they were always only 7 birds at first, and then they had babies, and some of them stayed. And when they were fewer, I used these colored wooden slats that I put on branches. So every bird had their own color and things like that. But that was too much to keep track of. Right bird at right color when there were 12. And I mean, I can tell them apart, but just not very fast. I have to look at, are you that one? Yeah, okay. So we transitioned to just, my criteria was basically sit on the station, keep your distance to other birds. As soon as they walked up to the syringe, when it wasn't very close to them, I would just pull it away and try to have a very, very high frequency of reinforcement at first so that we sort of nipped it in the bud before we saw any aggression at all. And then we could gradually increase the duration. So, and I tried to be very conscious about not reinforcing them when they were all like this, but you can see if you can tell in the video, but most of them are pretty calm. And this is not perfect at all at this stage. There's not much fighting, they're just... Don't know why it's so shaky. And we had a little sneaker there, but that's okay. And one of the reasons I think made it a lot easier to not have this aggression is because they were not hungry in any way. And this wasn't something that they only got then. It wasn't a super high value reinforcer. They just thought it was a lot of fun to have that syringe coming. If they would have been hungry, I would have used something that they didn't have access to. I probably would have had more problems with aggression. So I think that helped a lot. So yeah. And then we have, this is not a typical case study. I haven't written any ABCs or anything like that, but I thought this was a very interesting and a bit sad case as well, but very interesting. So this is Gunnar. Gunnar is a very typical old Swedish man name, but he was a 6-month-old parakeet, and a client brought him into the clinic where I work as a veterinary assistant. And he was brought in because the story was that he had hurt himself, so he couldn't fly anymore. You could tell that he was sort of struggling when he wanted to fly. And the story from the owners was that he was so scared of the other birds in the household that he had flown into something and hurt himself, which was very odd to me that a 6-month-old parakeet would be scared of other parakeets. In Sweden, we basically never hand feed parakeets. It can be a good thing to know as well. So everyone's parent reared. A young parakeet being scared of other parakeets, very odd. And we couldn't find anything wrong with him, or the vet couldn't rather, when they examined him. No broken bones, anything like that. We did do x-rays and didn't see anything. But the furcula, the sort of collar keybone, I don't know how you... Yeah, clavicle, yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. Could have been broken. We can't really see that on an x-ray on a bird that small, at least not with our equipment. So that was the theory that the vet had, that maybe it's hurting there and he just needs some time to heal, so maybe that will be better. But the owners, since he was scared of their birds, they didn't really know what to do with him. It was very odd. So they actually surrendered him to the clinic. And originally he was going to go home with a colleague of mine, but she just had to help rehome about 100 pet mice. So her place was a bit full. Yeah, I know. Pet mice and hamsters. So I said, I can help you with this one bird. That's fine. He wasn't kept with my birds in any way, so no, I didn't want to risk spreading diseases, of course. But I got him home. And the thing with him was that he was very odd in a sort of undefinable way. When you've worked with birds for many years, you sort of get a feel for what's normal behavior and but he was just, something was a bit off. And I couldn't really place my finger on what that was. But he really got scared, or what I interpreted as scared at least, out of nowhere. And that's not the client's observation in this case, it's my observation. So what I could see happening was that I had him in a very small cage because I didn't want him to use his wings, of course, since he was possibly hurt. He would sit there, it could be evening, he would just sit and sleep or do his thing. Nothing happened. I was at my computer, and he would just start screaming and flailing like full-blown panic in his cage without anything changing in the environment that I could tell. And I did film several times just to see if I might have missed, was there a bug, was there anything? Didn't see anything at least, so that was very odd. But at other times, he was actually very sociable, very inquisitive, which was very interesting because sometimes he was like, yeah, I want to hang out with you, sure, this is fun, here, I want to eat treats, do fun things. And other times he would be fully panicked just seeing me. When I tried to take him home from the clinic, he was in a small carrier, and as soon as I picked it up, I mean, it's normal for a budgie that's not very tame to think that's a bit scary and maybe react to that, but he had that full, budgie panic scream going on the whole way home. Like from the minute we left the clinic, the whole car ride home, which I've never encountered that before, so it was very odd to me. Okay. So gradually, this became worse. He became more and more fearful, more and more often. These sort of episodes became worse. And he did not seem to improve physically. He was with me for after about 3 weeks, I did not see any improvement at all. And if it was just an injury, we should have seen him being able to fly by that time. But when I let him fly just to see if it was possible for him, it didn't look like a hurt bird to me. It more looked like he had trouble coordinating his movements, which really made me think, maybe there's something more going on here. And very shortly after I made that observation, he had one of his fearful episodes, but this time it almost looked more like a seizure. He would sit in his cage and just like look with these motions around him and seemed to just block out the rest of the world. So one time he did that, and those also got worse. But one time he did that, and I tried to just like make contact with him to see if it was possible. He didn't even know I was there. I could pick him up, and this is what it looked like. Poor fella. Yeah, very widely open eyes. And before that, he was also screaming like a very scared bird. So it was very distressing to watch and very distressing for him, no doubt. So once he started doing that, I was going to work the next day, so I figured I'm just going to bring him them and talk to the vet who saw him, and we have to figure this out because this is something more definitely going on here. And that same night, he basically was on his back flailing in the cage and being very, very obviously affected by something. So we decided that we had to euthanize him, sadly. But we also sent him to get, Swedish words again? Necropsy, thank you. To see if we could figure out what that was. Because both me and the vet were very curious, because it was so diffuse at first, but then the progression was very clear into something that was very not normal. So what we found, or what the report said, was that he actually had myeloid leukemia, which is basically cancer in the bone marrow, only 6 months old, and it had already spread to the liver and kidneys. So that was very interesting to me because I got this bird that I had a hunch that something was like, this is just not right. I can't tell you what, but something's wrong. And it really taught me that I should trust my own observations more, and not just trust what other people say about a bird, but trust what I see rather. So, and it's a very rare thing in budgies. The normal, not the normal, but the more common thing would be lymphoma. We see that in birds a lot, but I have never ever, I speak like I'm a professional, I've only worked as a vet assistant for a year, but even the person doing the necropsy said that this was very, very uncommon. So sometimes it's yeah, it's not easy. And this is also one of the reasons why I think we should really look into the medical things of medical side of things a lot more with birds than people typically do, because even things like fear or aggression can very well have medical components to them, like pain or something like this, even though this is a very rare case. So yeah, and that's basically that.
I have some questions. I'd like to know, everyone in this room is IAABC, but how many work with birds where there's a large group of birds, whether it's a zoo or whether it's a sanctuary or even it's a veterinary hospital?
I do.
You do, yes. And Danica?
We work in a veterinary hospital. We don't have flocks, really.
No,
there.
No,
you see
but a lot of
birds.
different
We
birds.
see a fair number of birds, and we have a vet who works with us who
We have an
is
avian
a board
specialist.
Oh, wow, cool.
So we bounce a lot off of her. She's originally from Australia, so she also has some really cool, different
Wow.
experiences
Mhm.
compared to what we have.
Mhm.
What's her name? Because I see you're in math, so I.
Dr. Amber Lee is the specialist.
Oh,
Yeah.
I've heard about her. Yeah. Cool.
So when you have, you were talking about something that was so interesting about in Sweden about no wing trim, flight
Mhm.
feather trims, and about housing. And I don't know if the regulations in Sweden are the same as those in some of the other EU countries.
They're a bit different, I think.
They're a bit different
Yeah.
because it's so progressive and so ahead of the US.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean,
That
so
doesn't take too much.
amazingly ahead of the US. And I just was really curious about sort of the development of that. I have a friend who's been in the Netherlands for years and was working on, her name is Winnie Weinbeck.
Oh,
And she's worked, do you know her at all?
I know the
She's
name.
IABC too. All
I
right.
definitely know the name.
But she's been working on for a long time, and it's passed in the Netherlands about standards for no bird can be alone. It has to have a conspecific, and flight cage or aviary sizes. I don't know about the wing trims or not. And just how has that been received or supported by the public?
Well, it's first of all, you have to differentiate between like the public everyday bird owner and the public as in the parrot organizations and things. And the cool thing I think about how it progressed in Sweden was that it wasn't the government saying, hey, bird people, you should do this. It was the bird people saying, we should do this. This is what the law should be. So it was our own choice to have it like that rather than someone imposing it
So
on
is
us.
this people that were breeders or parrot keepers or
Mostly parrot
apical?
keepers.
Okay.
Actually, mostly pet parrot people, but also a few breeders. Yeah, and it's also, I mean, when we think about Sweden and Europe as a whole, and we see this in the zoo community as well, is that we have a very different tradition of ethology there. That's like where we come from, whereas in the US, there's a lot of tradition with behaviorism and training and things like that. So we're very behind when it comes to the training aspects of things. It's just like these last couple of years that zoos in Sweden even thought about, hey, maybe we should train our animals, even though they have these huge enclosures, naturalistic, lots of enrichment and things like that, but we sort of overlook that part of things. And I think that reflects in the keeping as well. Like I said in the enrichment talk, Swedes are like, yeah, keep birds with other birds, don't trim their wings, and then they basically don't need much more than that. Well, it's sort of maybe the opposite here. Of course, that's very generalizing, but so yeah, it's fun to see how these different traditions are sort of merging now in the last couple of years, making something really awesome, both in the zoo world and in the pet world, I think. So yeah, I don't even remember what your question was, sorry.
No, you answered a lot, and I'm also very curious about what kind of veterinary protocol that you have, that you've seen in the practice where you're a vet tech now versus the zoo with birds. And what I know for a long time, there's been importation into the EU. It's been stopped now for a while. I don't know about Sweden, but what is it that you're basically looking to rule out or test for?
It sort of depends. Mostly, if we're talking about infectious diseases, and I'm not an expert in this at all. I'm very new when it comes to working in a veterinary setting. I've been there barely for a year, and I'm not a vet tech. I don't have that education either. But what we test for is things like PBFD, it's psittacosis, and all the regular things, basically. But yeah, I'm sort of the wrong question, the wrong person.
But also, at least and I don't think so. I asked you because you're fairly new in that, and I don't know about the practice that you're in.
But the thing is that the vets I work with are fairly new as well.
Oh, they
so
are? Okay.
The person who started that clinic is a very, very experienced vet. Her name is Gunnel Andersson. She was, you know about her. Very awesome, super skilled woman, but she's retired now, and she's very adamant about keeping things that way. But so the vets that we have don't have a lot of experience. They're still very skilled, but they are new. It takes many years to build up the sort of experience that she had. So we are very enthusiastic, all of us, trying to do our best, but we're all very new. So, which is good in some ways, not in others. But yeah, it's interesting.
Well, and then the average client, are they supportive of doing, becoming involved or having their birds diagnostically tested or bringing them to the veterinarian?
It varies a lot. It varies a lot, as I would imagine it does here, and as it does with dogs and cats as well. Some people are very like, I want the best for my bird. I will 100% pay for this, and have their birds insured as well, which is a good thing. It's very cheap in Sweden, and it saves a lot of money. While some people are the regular, well, I paid more, or this x-ray costs more than my bird does, why would I do that?
Yes.
So, yeah.
I would say, like, one of the things that Dr. Lee has said, because she's worked in a few places, is that, if, when she was working at South Shore, VCH South Shore was an emergency hospital, she saw a lot of emergency cases and a lot of people who were not very well educated and a lot of poor prognoses. But where she is now at Wakefield, where she's doing general practice, you kind of build up your clientele. So they might start out pretty poorly knowledgeable, but they start to gain knowledge over time, and I think it also kind of spreads in the area.
Yes.
So you might start with people who are less willing to do diagnostics, and then you end up with a progressively more willing population.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously finances are an issue, but
Yes.
That's definitely the case. We also we see a lot of new clients very often because we're the only clinic in Stockholm that sees birds, and we're the clinic furthest up in the country that sees birds, and we're just like halfway up. So there's a lot of space that has to go like several miles to get to see the closest bird vet. So we definitely have a lot of new clients, but we also see that as well. Many clients have been there for 20 years. They started off not knowing anything, and we have bird classes as well. We have just started with a behavior clinic in the clinic, so people can actually come there both with dogs and cats, but also with birds for things like behavior problems. And that's a way for me to not do that in my own business time, but do it in the clinic time as well. So that works out nicely. But yeah, and many people are very excited about that. It's also very new to a lot of people because, I mean, I'm the only consultant in Sweden, so people aren't used to that kind of training and that kind of help being there. So it's difficult for that reason, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.